When fisherman Daniel Myers pulled his net from the gray Atlantic waters that morning, he expected the usual seaweed, driftwood, maybe a broken crate, but caught among the ropes was a photograph. It was old, water-stained, but strangely intact. A family of 3 smiling on a pier. A man, a woman, and a young boy holding a small red sailboat. The back of the photo bore only 2 words, written in faded ink, "Come home." Daniel had no idea that the faces in that picture would lead him to uncover a tragedy the sea had kept for 40 years and a promise that still waited to be kept. If the sea returned something lost to you, would you be brave enough to look for its story? Subscribe to Years Ago Stories, where the past resurfaces when we least expect it. The morning air carried that salty heaviness only coastal towns know, half mist, half memory. Daniel Myers had spent his entire life by these waters. At 58, his hands were shaped by rope and tide, his skin weathered like the boats he repaired in his youth. The small harbor of East Haven, once bustling with fishing fleets, now seemed quieter every year. Fewer boats, fewer men who remembered the names of the sea's moods. Yet Daniel still went out before dawn, not because he needed the money, but because he couldn't imagine sleeping through the sunrise. That particular morning, the sky had opened in a soft blush of orange and gray. He started the motor, his small trawler, the Marjorie, creaking as it cut through the shallow waves. He hummed under his breath the same tune his father had taught him, a song without words but heavy with rhythm. By mid-morning, the tide began to turn, and Daniel prepared to haul in his final net. The rope was heavier than usual, pulling with an uneven weight. He frowned, leaning his shoulder into the crank, water spraying over his boots. What he found inside wasn't the usual clutter of the deep. There were clumps of kelp, a broken buoy, a few crab shells, and something flat, wedged between them. He reached for it. It was a photograph, stuck against the mesh like a reluctant secret. The edges were frayed, the surface clouded with salt and time, but beneath the water stains, a scene slowly came into view, a wooden pier, sunlight reflecting off the waves, and a family frozen mid-laughter, a man with rolled sleeves, a woman with wind-blown hair, and a small boy holding a toy sailboat painted red. Daniel wiped the photo on his sleeve, careful not to tear it. On the back, faint handwriting emerged. "Come home." He stared at the words for a long time. The phrase felt less like an instruction and more like a whisper that had crossed time to find him. That night, after mending his nets, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. He placed the photograph on his kitchen table beside his coffee mug. The edges curled as it dried, giving it an almost breathing quality. He found himself wondering, who were they? Why had this picture survived when even metal rusted and wood sank? And who had written those 2 simple words? Come home. He tried searching online later that evening, typing vague phrases like lost photo found in sea and family picture washed ashore. Nothing. But when he zoomed in on the image under his lamp, he noticed something else. Behind the family, barely visible, was a sign nailed to the pier railing. It read, "Street Mary's Point, Summer 1982. Daniel blinked. That was just 2 miles south of where he fished a stretch of coast that had once been closed off after a boating accident, decades ago. He vaguely remembered the story. He'd been a teenager then. There had been a storm, a family missing at sea, a search party that lasted days, and then silence. No wreckage, no survivors, just whispers that the sea had taken them all. His pulse quickened. The faces in the photo, could they be that family? Daniel took the picture to Martha Cole, the owner of the local cafe who'd been around long enough to remember everything. She squinted through her reading glasses, turning the photo carefully. "Good heavens," she murmured. "That looks like the Hanleys." "The who?" Daniel asked. "David and Eleanor Hanley," Martha said softly. "They lived near the cliffs, in that white cottage with the blue shutters. And their boy, what was his name? Maybe Michael?" Daniel guessed. Martha nodded. "Yes, Michael. They disappeared that summer. Boat capsized, I think. Never found the bodies." She sighed. tragic story. Poor Eleanor's sister moved away after that. Couldn't stand the sight of the ocean. Daniel looked at the photo again. Then why now? Why would this come back after 40 years? Martha smiled sadly. The sea doesn't forget, Daniel. It just takes its time returning what belongs to the shore. That night, Daniel placed the photograph on his nightstand, beside his old brass alarm clock. He lay awake long after midnight, the rhythm of the waves echoing through his open window. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean had chosen him, that somehow, by pulling that net, he'd answered a call he didn't yet understand. And when he finally drifted into sleep, he dreamt of the pier in the photo sunlight, laughter, a red sailboat drifting just out of reach, and a voice whispering through the wind, "Come home." The next morning, Daniel couldn't ignore it anymore. The photo sat on his kitchen table, curling at the edges like it wanted to move to go somewhere. He decided to start where the picture had been taken, Street Mary's Point. The road there wound along the cliffs, narrow and silent. Fog rolled in from the sea, blurring the line between sky and water. When Daniel parked his truck by the shore, the pier from the photograph was still there, or what remained of it. The old wooden posts rose from the surf like ribs of a long-dead whale. Gulls perched on them, crying into the wind. Time had eaten away most of the boards, leaving only fragments of what once was. Daniel stepped onto the cracked path, the photo in his pocket. Each step creaked beneath him, and the smell of salt and decay filled his lungs. At the far end of the pier, he crouched down and held the photo against the horizon, aligning it with what was left of the view. The cliffs matched, the railing, even the shape of the distant lighthouse. The only thing missing was the laughter frozen in that image. He turned to the right where, in the photo, behind the family, a small white house stood on the bluff. Now, only its ruins remained. A crumbling chimney, ivy-covered walls, and the faint outline of blue shutters faded by decades of storms. As Daniel approached, he noticed something strange. Despite the decay, the house didn't feel abandoned. The path leading up to the front door was freshly trodden. The grass had been cut. He hesitated, then knocked on the door frame. "Hello?" A voice called back, soft and cautious. "Who's there?" An elderly woman appeared, wrapped in a wool cardigan, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun. She looked to be in her late 70s, thin, alert, but kind-eyed. "I'm sorry to bother you," Daniel said, removing his cap. "My name's Daniel Myers. I found something near the old pier. Thought you might know something about it." He handed her the photograph. Her hands trembled as she took it. She gasped the kind of gasp that comes not from surprise, but from recognition too long buried. "My God," she whispered. "Where did you get this?" "It was tangled in my fishing net," Daniel said softly. "Yesterday morning, just off the coast." Tears welled in her eyes. "That's my sister, Eleanor, and David, and my nephew, Michael." Daniel felt a chill. "You're her sister?" She nodded slowly. "My name's Margaret Coleman. They vanished in 1982. I was only 35. She looked at the photograph again, her thumb tracing the small red sailboat. "They said their boat capsized in the storm, but the sea never gave them back." Daniel hesitated. "Do you know who might have written this?" He pointed to the faded message on the back. "Come home." Margaret's face tightened. "Eleanor wrote that. I recognize her handwriting anywhere. But she sent me letters every summer. None of them ever said this." She shook her head. "No, this was something else." They sat in silence for a while. The wind pushed against the broken shutters, making them groan like an old memory. Margaret finally spoke. "I used to come here every week after they were gone, sat by the pier and waited for a sign, anything. But nothing ever came. After a while, people told me to move on. I did, but not really." Daniel nodded, his voice low. "Sometimes the sea holds on to things longer than it should." She smiled faintly. Maybe it holds on to love, too. Margaret led him inside the old house. It smelled of salt, wood smoke, and lavender. On the mantelpiece stood a collection of framed photographs, most yellowed with age. Daniel noticed one immediately, a black and white image of Eleanor and David on their wedding day. Next to it, a small toy boat, red, chipped, and dusty. Daniel stared. "The same boat from the photo." "Yes," Margaret said. "I found it washed ashore a week after the accident. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away." He ran his finger along its edge. "Maybe this isn't a coincidence," he murmured. Margaret looked at him sharply. "You think the sea sent this photo back for a reason?" Daniel shrugged. "Maybe it wanted to finish something. Maybe it's time the story was told." Before leaving, Margaret handed him a box. "Here," she said. "These are the last letters Eleanor wrote me. Maybe they'll help you understand." That night, Daniel sat by his kitchen window, listening to the sea. He opened one of the envelopes. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged. The 14th of June, 1982. Dearest Maggie, David wants to take the boat out one last time before we sell it. Michael is thrilled he's been painting his toy sailboat to match. Don't worry, we'll stay close to shore. You know David, he's careful. We'll be home before sunset. Daniel set the letter down. His fingers trembled slightly. There were more letters, but this one ended abruptly. No signature, no farewell, as if she'd been interrupted. And at the bottom corner, faintly visible beneath the ink, were water stains shaped almost like fingerprints. He stared out at the dark horizon beyond the window, the waves rolling endlessly under the moonlight, and whispered to no one in particular. "Eleanor, what really happened out there?" For the next few days, Daniel couldn't focus on fishing. The photograph haunted him, as if the faces inside it had followed him home. Every creak of his boat, every roll of the tide, seemed to carry the faint echo of a child's laughter, and the whisper of waves saying, "Come home." He reread Eleanor's letters each night. The words were ordinary, domestic, filled with love and small worries, the kind of sentences people write when they don't know they're about to vanish. But something in the final lines of the last note unsettled him. The ink was darker, the pressure heavier, almost as if written in haste. He decided to visit the Harbor Records Office, a small building near the docks that kept all maritime logs since the 1942. The clerk, a balding man named Mr. Keene, squinted at Daniel's request. "Hanley family, 1982? Keene muttered, rifling through dusty files. "Ah, yes, tragic case. The Coast Guard's report said the storm came in faster than predicted. Boat went missing off Street Mary's Point. Search lasted 6 days. Official cause, presumed drowned." Daniel nodded slowly. "No wreckage found?" Keene hesitated. "None. Not a splinter. Not a life jacket." Daniel frowned. "How's that possible? The sea always returns something." The man shrugged. "Some storms bury their secrets deep." That night, Daniel drove back toward the cliffs. The moon hung low, a pale coin against the restless black. He parked near the shore and walked to where the pier ended, the wind slicing through his jacket. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, the same faint scent of salt clinging to it even now. The words on the back, "Come home," seemed almost darker in the moonlight. He whispered, "If there's something you want me to find, show me." The sea didn't answer, not in words, but the tide shifted suddenly, lapping higher up the rocks. He took a step closer, heart thudding, as something pale caught the moonlight beneath the waves. It was the edge of a wooden plank, half buried in sand. He crouched, brushing away debris until the faint letters appeared. Hanley. His breath caught. Part of the missing boat. The next day, he brought the fragment to Margaret. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes wet. "After all these years," she whispered, "it's like they're finally coming home." She placed the wood beside the toy sailboat, the two pieces of red paint almost identical in hue despite the decades between them. Daniel told her about the tides, the photo, the feeling he couldn't shake that something remained unfinished. Margaret listened, then said quietly, "There's one place you haven't looked yet." "Where's that?" "The old lighthouse keeper's station," she said. "Just north of the point. They say during the storm he saw something lights on the water where there shouldn't have been any." Daniel leaned forward. "You knew the keeper?" She nodded. "Mr. Larkin. He passed away a few years ago, but his son still lives nearby. He might remember what his father said that night." The following morning, Daniel met Samuel Larkin, a quiet man in his 60s, who carried the same watchful calm as his father once had. The old lighthouse still stood tall against the cliffs, its lens clouded with rust and memory. When Daniel mentioned the Hanleys, Samuel's expression changed. "My father talked about that night until the day he died," he said. "He saw their boat." Daniel's pulse quickened. "He did?" Samuel nodded. The storm had already turned violent. He said he saw a light, a lantern, maybe drifting near the point. Then it vanished. He tried to signal back, but the power cut out. By the time he reached the shore, there was nothing left. Daniel hesitated. "Did he ever say anything else?" Samuel exhaled. "Only once. He said the sea wasn't the one that took them." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Samuel shook his head. He never explained, but when he said it, he was holding something, an old photograph. He'd found it washed up a few days later. Said it wasn't just a photo. It was a message. Daniel stared at him. "A photograph? What happened to it?" Samuel pointed toward a wooden box on the shelf. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a second picture nearly identical to Daniel's. Except this one showed the same family standing by the pier at dusk. But this time, there were only two people in the frame. The boy was gone. Daniel's chest tightened. "So, there were two photographs?" Samuel nodded. "Looks that way. My father thought one was taken just before the accident, and the other after." "But how could that be?" Daniel whispered. "Who took the second one?" Samuel only said, "My father always believed the sea has ways of keeping what it wants and showing what it must." That night, Daniel placed the two photographs side by side on his table. One, a smiling family of 3 daylight, laughter, innocence. The other, twilight, two silhouettes staring into the distance, their smiles gone. He studied them under the lamplight, tracing every detail until he noticed something he hadn't before on the far right corner of the second photo. A faint reflection on the water. It looked like a child's face. Not clear. Just a blur of light shaped like eyes, nose, and a small mouth. Daniel shivered. He leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Michael?" The clock ticked once, twice, then stopped its second hand frozen at midnight. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the two photographs merging together, faces flickering in and out of view, the child's reflection shifting like light beneath waves. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. He gathered both photos, the fragment of the boat, and Eleanor's last letter, then drove toward Street Mary's Point. The sea was calm that morning, unnaturally so, a silence that felt almost watchful. The sun hung low as he launched the Marjorie into the tide, heading toward the spot where he'd found the first photo. The water glimmered like glass, its surface hiding whatever truths it had kept all these years. When he reached the coordinates, he cut the engine. The only sounds were the gulls and the slow rhythm of the tide tapping against the hull. He opened Eleanor's letter again, running his thumb across the faint water stains. "What were you trying to say?" he whispered. For a moment, he thought he heard an answer, a soft creak, as though the sea itself exhaled. Then, something rose to the surface, just off the bow, a piece of driftwood, dark and slick, followed by another. He leaned over. The two pieces drifted together, forming a rough outline of a door frame. It looked almost deliberate, like the entrance to a place only memory could reach. Daniel steadied his breath and whispered, "If you want to come home, show me how." A sudden gust swept across the water, and in the distance, the tide shimmered with movement, hundreds of tiny bubbles rising in a single column. He steered toward it, heart racing. When he reached the spot, the water was clearer than he'd ever seen it. Beneath the surface lay the faint shadow of something large wooden beams, tangled nets, the broken curve of a hull, the Hanley's boat. Daniel's throat tightened. After 40 years, it had been here all along, resting quietly beneath the waves. He dropped anchor and leaned over the side. For a second, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of light below. Then the reflection changed, and the faint image of a boy's face appeared on the water's surface again, smiling softly before vanishing. Daniel whispered, "Michael." And then he noticed something caught between the planks of the wreckage, a small metal tin, wedged under coral and silt. He grabbed his net pole and carefully pulled it free. The tin was rusted but sealed tight. He pried it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper, waterlogged but still legible. The handwriting matched Eleanor's. "If this is ever found, please tell Margaret we weren't afraid. The sea took the boat, but not us. We tried to swim, but the current pulled Michael away. He let go so we could live. If you find this, tell her he was brave. Tell her he smiled. We're going home." Daniel's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He clutched the note to his chest, the words echoing through him like a tide returning to shore. They hadn't simply vanished. They'd tried. They'd fought. And in their final moments, they'd thought of home. He brought the note to Margaret that evening. She opened it slowly, reading every word twice, her hands trembling. When she finished, she pressed the paper to her heart. "He smiled," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "All these years, I thought they were scared. But they weren't." He smiled. Daniel sat beside her, silent. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the shutters. The smell of salt filled the room, as though the sea itself had come to listen. Margaret looked up. "It's like the ocean waited until we were ready to know." Daniel nodded. Maybe that's what "come home" meant. The next morning, they held a small memorial at the pier. Daniel, Margaret, and a few townsfolk gathered with flowers and lanterns. The tide rolled gently beneath them, quiet and forgiving. Margaret placed the photograph, the one Daniel had found, inside a glass frame and set it on the water's edge. "This time," she said softly, "we send you home with light." As she released it, the waves carried the frame away, the reflection of the sunrise dancing across the glass. Daniel watched until it disappeared beyond the horizon. He felt no sadness, only a strange peace. The kind that comes when something finally finds its way back to where it belongs. That night, Daniel returned to his boat. The air was still, the sea calm. He turned on the small cabin light and looked at the clock, the one that had stopped at midnight the night before. It ticked once, then again, and then, quietly, it started running. He smiled faintly. "Guess it's time." He took one last look at the ocean, endless, ancient, and forgiving, and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the waves glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if answering him back, and from the dark horizon, a single red sailboat, small, handmade, and glowing faintly like a memory reborn, drifted toward the shore. In the weeks that followed, the tides of East Haven seemed gentler, almost lighter, as though something unseen had finally lifted from the shore. The sea, which had always felt like a keeper of secrets, now breathed quietly, at peace with itself. Daniel continued fishing, but not every day anymore. Some mornings he simply sat on the pier with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise spread gold across the waves. He carried the Hanley story with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even the sea, vast and cold, had a memory shaped by love. The photograph he had found now rested in a small frame on his mantel, beside a seashell and a lantern. Every now and then, he would glance at it and smile. The faces no longer looked lost to him. They looked like they had found their way home. 2 months later, a package arrived at his door, marked From the Maritime Museum of Devonport. Inside was a letter from the curator, Amelia Rhodes. Dear Mr. Myers, we were informed of your discovery through the East Haven Historical Society. The Hanley disappearance is a known case here, and your recovery of the photograph and note is deeply significant. We'd be honored to display them not as tragedy, but as proof that love can cross even the distance of time. If you consent, the items will be preserved under your name, the Myers Recovery Collection. With gratitude, Amelia Rhodes. Daniel sat with the letter for a long time. He thought of Eleanor, of Margaret, of Michael, and the little red sailboat that had once drifted away from the pier. And then, with a quiet smile, he nodded. He packed the photo, the note, and the fragment of the Hanley boat into a small wooden box and mailed it that same day. A few weeks later, Margaret and Daniel visited the museum together. The exhibit was simple but beautiful. A glass case displaying the water-stained photograph, the letter from Eleanor, and the tiny red toy sailboat that Margaret had finally agreed to part with. The plaque read, "The Hanley family, 1982, lost at sea, remembered through the tides. Discovered by Daniel Myers, 2025. Proof that the ocean, like memory, always returns what truly belongs." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she stood before the display. "It's strange," she whispered. "For so long, I wanted answers, but now that I have them, I just feel calm." Daniel smiled. Maybe that's what closure really is, not the end, but the quiet after the storm. They lingered there for a long time. People passed by, reading the plaque, lowering their voices, sensing the weight of what it meant. A young boy stopped to look at the red sailboat and said softly, "It looks like mine." Margaret smiled, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Then take care of it," she said. "Boats like that carry stories." That evening, Daniel walked alone along the cliffs. The air was cool, the sea below turning silver under the rising moon. He could still see the faint light of the lighthouse sweeping across the dark, just as it had on that stormy night 4 decades ago. He stopped near the edge where the grass met the rocks and took a folded letter from his pocket. He had written it the night before. "To the Hanleys, wherever you are. The sea brought your story home. Margaret is at peace now. Your laughter lives on through the waves, through every sunrise over East Haven. I see you in every reflection of light on the water. Rest easy. You are home." He folded it once more and released it into the wind. The paper fluttered out of his hand, caught an updraft, and disappeared into the silver horizon. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, breathing in the scent of salt and memory. Then, from somewhere below, he thought he heard something, the faint sound of a child's laughter carried by the wind. He smiled. "Good night, Michael." A year later, Daniel's small story made its way into newspapers and short documentaries. People called it The Miracle of the Sea. Others called it coincidence. But for the quiet coastal town of East Haven, it became something more, a tale to be told on stormy nights. A story about how love doesn't drown. It just waits beneath the tide. The museum exhibit drew visitors from across the country. Some came out of curiosity, others seeking comfort for their own losses. Many left notes beside the glass, short messages like, "For my brother, gone to the waves, may he find his way home. For the father I never met, thank you for the tide that brought me peace. For everyone the sea took too soon, may their memories rise again." The curators started collecting them, calling it the Wall of Return. And somewhere in the middle of all those messages, someone had placed a small, hand-drawn picture of a boy holding a red sailboat. Sometimes, the past doesn't vanish. It simply drifts waiting for the tide, the right hands, or the right heart to find it. And sometimes, what the sea gives back isn't just an object. It's a story, one that reminds us we're all searching for home in our own way. If you've ever found something that carried someone else's story, a letter, a photo, a forgotten keepsake, share it in the comments below. Subscribe to Years Ago Stories, where every wave, every whisper, And every photograph carries a memory waiting to return.